Some children were erased before they even learned their own names. Their lives slipped between court corridors and whispered rumours, shaped more by silence than by blood. What the portraits never showed is how many heirs walked the earth unseen, carrying stories the kingdom refused to claim. Some truths were buried not to protect innocence, but to preserve power. Tonight, you will walk with the forgotten ones and hear what history tried to hide. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is, where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand in the private corridors of Tudor palaces, far from the great halls and the glitter of ceremony, one would notice that the first victims of secrecy were always the smallest and quietest. These children, born without the shield of a legal marriage, existed in a world where lineage determined everything, and silence was often the only protection offered to those who had none. They appeared suddenly in records and disappeared just as quickly, slipping through the cracks of a society that valued bloodlines only when they could be displayed openly. Their presence was treated as an inconvenience, a reminder of desires that conflicted with duty, and the homes that should have protected them became places where truth was softened until it vanished. Life for an unacknowledged child began with concealment. When a woman in service or low rank found herself pregnant by a nobleman, the first response was not care, but panic. The palace or manor tightened around her like a net, demanding silence. She was moved away from view, dismissed quietly, or sent to a distant relation under the pretense of illness. No one spoke openly of the father, and no one imagined the child would ever be named. Within Tudor culture, legitimacy was not a question of biology, but of marriage. And without that legal boundary, a child's existence served only as a reminder of someone's moral failing. Even before birth, the child's life had already been shaped by decisions made without them. These infants grew up in the shadows of a powerful society that relied heavily on appearances. Outsiders saw the Tudor elite as a world of order, where noble families presented perfect images of loyalty and inheritance. Yet within that same world, uncounted children were raised by servants who whispered instructions about silence and discretion. Some were given small coins or minor allowances from unnamed benefactors, and some were simply abandoned to the care of poor households that received irregular payments to keep them fed. Many never knew why no one spoke their father's name. Many never realized that the man who passed them in the street shared their features. The danger of recognition hung over them constantly. A child with a nobleman's jawline or the unmistakable hair of a royal attendant became a liability. The resemblance alone could spark rumours. And rumours were enough to ruin reputations built over decades. A nobleman with a wandering past preferred the child to remain invisible, and the courts around him cooperated. In Tudor society, silence held more authority than truth, and any revelation of illegitimacy threatened the fragile balance between public virtue and private behaviour. For the families involved, denial was safer than honesty. Among the elite, this denial became a habit. Lords who fathered children outside marriage often justified their actions as part of noble privilege, but they seldom extended that privilege to the lives they created. The children were given none of the rights attached to lineage. They could not inherit land, titles, or even the dignity of a public name. Their identities were shaped by absence of acknowledgement, absence of protection, absence of a place within the structure that defined Tudor social life. They grew up learning that their birth made them simultaneously connected to power and excluded from it. For the mothers, the consequences were equally severe. While men were permitted indulgences, women suffered the full burden of moral judgment. A woman who bore an illegitimate child faced accusations of corruption and lacked the status to defend herself. Without the protection of marriage, She became an easy target for dismissal or humiliation. Many were removed from service, cast away from the only life they knew, and forced into marriages arranged solely to hide the scandal. The child she carried was evidence, and evidence needed to be hidden. Despite these hardships, the infants themselves were helpless participants in a silent arrangement accepted across Tudor society. They filled the margins of history, recorded only in scattered letters, small payments, or notes from parish officials. Their lives were quiet, but the consequences of their existence were far-reaching. Every noble household lived with the tension between desire and duty, and these children represented the cost of that imbalance. The court preferred to forget them, and those who survived did so by blending into a world that refused to speak their names. It is unsettling to imagine walking through a Tudor estate knowing that behind certain doors, a child slept whose life had been shaped entirely by secrecy. These children were not hidden because they were loved, but because their existence revealed contradictions the elite preferred to ignore. Their stories force us to see the foundations of Tudor power not as clean lines of inheritance, but as a fragile structure supported by silence, fear, and the willingness to pretend. They were born into a world that measured worth by legitimacy, and yet they carried noble blood that could never be admitted. Their lives exposed the distance between public morality and private behavior, a distance that shaped an entire era. In a society that marked every person by lineage, these children lived without it. They navigated a world where a surname could determine survival. Yet the name that should have been theirs was withheld. The system that denied them recognition also relied on their invisibility, creating a cycle in which their very existence remained unspoken. To study them is to recognize the shadowed spaces beneath Tudor grandeur, where truth was kept quiet to protect reputations that mattered more than human lives. They stood as the quiet evidence of choices made far above them. Contained by a society built on appearances, their presence hinted at fractures that noble families worked carefully to hide. And somewhere beyond those guarded walls, another story was already beginning to gather weight in the dark. Relationships within the Tudor elite unfolded quietly, woven into the routines of households that appeared orderly from the outside but were shaped by private tensions beneath their surfaces. Noblemen moved through halls where servants and ladies-in-waiting lived in constant proximity to power, and this closeness created situations that rarely aligned with the moral standards the court claimed to uphold. Affairs did not emerge from passion so much as from circumstance, moments in which hierarchy created opportunities that could not easily be refused. These connections became part of the daily rhythm of aristocratic life, quietly accepted even as they carried risks for those who had the least control over them. Women in noble households lived under a social framework that offered them no real protection. Their duties placed them near the men who governed their lives, and this nearness created expectations they could not openly challenge. A woman approached by a nobleman understood the imbalance immediately. Refusal was dangerous. Acquiescence, equally so. Once involved, she learned the rule that guided all such relationships: silence. A pregnancy only intensified this need. When the signs appeared, households acted quickly to conceal the truth. The woman was moved, dismissed, or sent away with explanations designed to prevent suspicion. The father remained untouched by consequence, while the woman carried the weight of a secret that reshaped her future without altering his. Tudor society judged men and women by different standards. A nobleman's indiscretions were treated as predictable extensions of his status, whispered about privately but never punished. Those around him regarded his choices as unfortunate but unsurprising. A woman in the same situation faced condemnation before she spoke a word. Her reputation became fragile, her prospects diminished, and her presence in the household transformed into a liability. Even when her involvement was forced or coerced, she bore the moral blame while the man resumed his public life unchanged. The court's environment reinforced this disparity. It was a place defined by ritual, surveillance, and ranks layered so precisely that everyone understood how deeply their futures depended on the perception of purity. Women existed within this structure as both essential labor and vulnerable targets. They cleaned chambers, dressed noble women, handled correspondence, and lived in spaces where privacy barely existed. Noble men, able to move freely, entered their lives without needing permission or explanation. A brief encounter might be overlooked by others, but its consequences linger long after the moment passes. Household records, though sparse in detail, reveal glimpses of these relationships. Sudden financial allowances, abrupt relocations of female servants, and scattered references in letters suggest patterns far more widespread than the surviving documents openly admit. Servants recognized these shifts immediately. They watched as familiar faces disappeared under quiet circumstances, replaced by new workers whose names would eventually follow the same path. These disappearances became part of the rhythm of aristocratic life, accepted by those who understood the necessity of maintaining a household's pristine exterior. The silence surrounding these relationships was not the product of ignorance, but of convenience. Noble families relied on order, and order required avoiding scandal. Affairs were tolerated as long as they remained invisible. Exposure risked threatening marriages, alliances, and inheritances. Women who became pregnant introduced complications that could not be resolved through denial alone, and their removal became the simplest solution. Every such removal reinforced the system that allowed the affairs to continue. The moral division between men and women grew sharper in these moments. A man who fathered a child outside marriage faced no interruption to his position. He continued to host guests, negotiate politics, and receive deference. A woman burdened by the same event faced uncertainty that could stretch across years. She might be placed into a marriage designed to erase her past or left to navigate poverty without support. Her life became evidence of conduct the household refused to acknowledge, and therefore, she had to disappear. Over time, these patterns shaped the quiet machinery of Tudor domestic life. Relationships formed and dissolved in the shadows of grand chambers, leaving behind consequences that extended far beyond the individuals involved. Those who served noble households learned to interpret the subtle signs, a closed door at an unusual hour, a young woman summoned privately, hurried decisions made by the household's senior members. Each sign signaled a situation that would be concealed rather than confronted. The existence of these affairs created fractures that were never spoken aloud, but influenced every part of the household's structure. Hierarchy allowed these relationships to flourish, and fear ensured they remained hidden. Women carried the risks and the silence. Men carried nothing at all. The imbalance became one of the defining features of elite life, shaping the experiences of everyone who lived within its reach. These quiet connections revealed how power acted without resistance inside noble households. Their consequences traced invisible lines across the lives of those unable to escape them. And beyond the edges of these hidden encounters, a deeper cost of secrecy was beginning to form. The structure of Tudor society rested on a strict hierarchy that left little room for ambiguity, and children born outside of marriage became the clearest proof of how firmly that hierarchy determined a person's worth. Their lineage might tie them to noble blood, yet the absence of a sanctioned union erased every trace of that connection in the eyes of the law. Within this system, legitimacy functioned not as a reflection of ancestry, but as a legal boundary separating those who belonged from those who were merely tolerated. A child without the protection of a recognized marriage was placed at the outer edge of the social order, granted neither inheritance nor acknowledgement. In households where property, titles, and alliances shaped every decision, legitimacy served as a tool to control the future. Families invested decades in securing their lineage, arranging marriages that strengthened political ties and preserved wealth. Any child born outside this framework threatened the delicate balance of inheritance, not because of personal fault, but because accepting such a child meant rewriting the order that defined the family's standing. The safest solution was erasure. Documents ignored their existence. Legal records omitted their names. And the court spoke of lineage as though no deviation had ever occurred. For the legally recognized family, the presence of an illegitimate child represented more than a moral complication. It presented a challenge to property and authority. Titles could not be divided. Lands could not be reassigned. And alliances could not be compromised. The legitimate heirs were raised to occupy the positions predetermined for them, while those born outside marriage were left without any claim, regardless of shared blood. This system ensured that property remained concentrated, reinforcing the status of families who relied on continuity for political survival. The law reinforced these distinctions with precision. It did not matter whether a nobleman acknowledged the child privately. Acknowledgement held no legal weight without marriage. Even a man who felt responsibility toward the child could not elevate them to the level of his legitimate heirs. Parliament and the courts made clear that property belonged to the lawful family alone. Attempts to change this order were rare and dangerous. For any disruption to inheritance jeopardized more than wealth. It threatened alliances, marriages, and entire networks of influence. Social judgment proved even harsher than the law. Communities viewed illegitimacy as a mark that followed a child throughout life. Regardless of ability or character, people spoke of birth as though it were a moral failing rather than a circumstance imposed on the child. Church records, often the only place where ordinary people's lives were documented, identified illegitimate children in ways that ensured the stain remained visible for generations. Their baptisms, when recorded at all, carried labels that signaled their exclusion from respectable society. For noble families, this exclusion served a purpose. It preserved clarity. A lineage unsullied by irregular births strengthened a family's place within the hierarchy, ensuring that marriages could be arranged without fear of unexpected claims. The presence of an illegitimate child, even if known only among servants, created anxiety about inheritance disputes or political vulnerability. Entire households cooperated to prevent such complications, shaping their routines around the need to keep the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate absolutely clear. This system placed illegitimate children into a quiet, enduring limbo. They lived in a world where they shared blood with those who shaped England's future. Yet they remained invisible in the structures that determined who had power. Their names rarely appeared in wills. Their connections were never acknowledged in public, and their futures depended entirely on the goodwill of those who wished to avoid scandal. They might receive a small allowance, a place in a distant household, or training for a modest trade. But these gestures did not alter the boundaries that defined their place. The exclusion became complete once the family's line of succession was considered. The legitimate heirs grew up surrounded by assurances of their rights. They studied governance, managed estates, and married into powerful families. The illegitimate children, regardless of their talents, were guided toward lives that kept them far from positions where their lineage might raise questions. The hierarchy required their silence, and so they learned to live without recognition, carrying the shadow of their origins without the means to challenge it. In this way, Tudor society preserved its order by denying the humanity of those born outside its rules. The system functioned smoothly because everyone involved understood their role within it. Families protected their status. The law enforced boundaries, and the church maintained moral definitions that justified exclusion. The children themselves had no voice. Their erasure ensured the continuity of a world that valued appearance above truth. Their place in society revealed how deeply hierarchy shaped every life under Tudor rule. Their erasure exposed the limits of compassion in a world built on inheritance and control. Somewhere beyond these rigid boundaries, a silent consequence of this exclusion was beginning to gather weight. Children born from the unions between kings and their servants occupied one of the most precarious positions in Tudor society. suspended between immense power and absolute vulnerability. Their existence revealed the contradictions at the heart of royal life. Where authority appeared absolute but personal conduct unfolded in private rooms, far removed from public expectation. These children emerged from encounters shaped not by equality but by hierarchy. And from the moment of birth, they carried the consequences of actions over which they had no control. Their lives became quiet extensions of the king's private decisions, acknowledged only when it served a political purpose, and concealed whenever their presence threatened the stability of the court. Some of these children were recognized, though recognition came selectively and with limitations. A king might choose to acknowledge an illegitimate son when doing so offered political advantage or projected his strength to foreign courts. The most notable example, Henry Fitzroy, received titles and estates not because his birth was free of complication, but because his father found usefulness in elevating him. His public acknowledgement served as a statement of authority, yet even he, despite unusual favour, remained outside the line of succession. His case illustrated both the possibility of privilege and the permanence of exclusion. For every child like him, dozens of others lived in obscurity, shaped by the very same blood without receiving the slightest trace of recognition. In most cases, concealment was the preferred response. Royal households operated under the constant pressure to maintain an image of discipline, purity, and divine order. The birth of a child from a servant or lady-in-waiting disrupted this image, drawing attention to the private behaviour of a monarch whose authority depended heavily on public perception. As soon as a pregnancy was suspected, courtiers acted to control the situation. The woman involved was removed from the palace, transferred to a distant estate, or placed under the supervision of trusted attendants who ensured the birth unfolded far from the court's eyes. Once the child arrived, decisions were made behind closed doors. Who would raise the infant? What support would be offered? And how thoroughly the connection to the king must be erased. These children lived in a world where the blood that tied them to the throne offered neither protection nor dignity. They grew up among families who understood their origins but were instructed never to speak of them. Their features often betrayed their lineage, echoing the faces of men who ruled the kingdom. Yet these resemblances only heightened the need for silence. The households that sheltered them learned to avoid questions, shaping stories that explained their presence without revealing the truth. Servants became guardians of these fictions, ensuring that no careless remark reached the ears of those who might weaponize the information. Within the larger framework of Tudor society, the existence of these children highlighted the profound imbalance between power and accountability. A king's actions could alter the course of nations, yet the children produced by those same actions were left without legal standing. They occupied a liminal position, neither fully rejected nor fully accepted. Their lives were shaped by decisions made by others, whether they would receive an education, whether they would be provided for financially, and whether they would ever know the identity of their father. The uncertainty that defined their circumstances became a quiet inheritance passed to them without choice. For the women who bore these children, the consequences were immediate and severe. Their roles within the palace were conditioned by obedience and involvement with the king, whether voluntary or coerced, placed them in a position where silence was essential. Pregnancy marked the end of their service, often followed by relocation or forced marriage arranged to conceal the truth. The court protected the king by removing the woman and burying the evidence of the affair within layers of secrecy. Her life changed permanently, while the king continued his reign, unburdened by the personal cost. The children themselves grew up sensing the boundaries of their world. They witnessed the lives of legitimate royal offspring from a distance, understanding instinctively that they could never cross the threshold into that realm of privilege. Their upbringing often ensured they remained useful but unthreatening. Some served in minor offices, some pursued quiet trades, and some disappeared entirely from written history, leaving only hints in parish records or household accounts. Their significance to the monarchy rested not in who they were, but in who they were forbidden to become. Over time, these children formed a hidden layer beneath the royal narrative, lives unrecorded in official histories, but deeply entangled with the structures of power. Their presence complicated the image of the royal household while revealing the mechanisms used to protect it. They stood close to authority, but were denied the right to claim any part of it. Their existence exposed the widening gap between the public expectations placed on the monarchy and the private realities that shaped its inner workings. To understand their position is to see the monarchy not as a flawless institution, but as a system built on conflicting demands. Kings were expected to embody moral stability, yet their private conduct often contradicted this ideal. The children born from these contradictions bore the cost. Their lives demonstrate how Tudor power could elevate a man to absolute authority, while simultaneously abandoning those most directly affected by his actions. They lived without name, without claim, and without the protection their lineage should have afforded them. Their circumstances revealed how royal authority could create lives it refused to acknowledge. Their invisibility exposed the fragile distance between sovereign power and personal consequence. Far beyond the guarded chambers of the court, the fate of these concealed children was already shaping new shadows across the kingdom. Women who bore children for noblemen without the protection of marriage occupied one of the most vulnerable positions in Tudor society. Their lives changed abruptly the moment a pregnancy became suspected. And from that point forward, every decision surrounding them served a single purpose: preserving the reputation of the household and shielding the man involved from scrutiny. What had been routine work within the palace transformed instantly into a landscape of suspicion, eye distance, and quiet monitoring. The woman no longer moved freely through the rooms she once served. She became a problem to be managed, a reminder of actions the court refused to acknowledge openly. The first response from the household was removal. Once her condition became difficult to conceal, she was taken away from the palace, with explanations crafted to avoid alarm. Some were dismissed abruptly under the pretense of misconduct. Others were sent to distant estates where their absence could be ignored. These departures were rarely recorded, and no formal statement explained why they had gone. The speed of these decisions ensured that no rumours gained traction, and within days, their presence faded from the routines of palace life. Servants learned not to ask questions, understanding that silence protected their own positions. Those who were forced into marriage faced a different kind of erasure. A union might be arranged quickly, often with a man of lower standing who agreed to accept the situation in exchange for payment or advantage. The purpose of such marriages was not to support the woman, but to provide a cover story that concealed the lineage of the child. Her identity became tied to a narrative she did not choose, and her future unfolded within a framework designed to protect the man who had caused the scandal. The marriage did not elevate her position. It merely redirected suspicion away from the palace. Regardless of the path chosen for her, the woman carried the burden of shame alone. Society regarded her pregnancy as evidence of moral failure, even when she had little control over the circumstances. The court applied one standard to men and another to women. And in this system, the woman's body became the public proof of wrongdoing. Her name circulated in hushed conversations. Stripped of context or sympathy, those who once shared work with her now treated her as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of stepping outside prescribed boundaries. Her fall from favour served as reinforcement for the social order, demonstrating how quickly a servant's place could collapse. Fear became a constant condition for these women. They lived with the knowledge that speaking truthfully about the father of their child could bring severe punishment. No accusation against a nobleman would be believed, and any complaint could result in imprisonment or permanent exile from respectable society. Their silence protected them from immediate harm, but also cut them off from support. They navigated pregnancies without the security of family, rank, or legal recognition, relying on the uncertain goodwill of those who wished primarily to avoid scandal. After the child was born, the woman's connection to the infant grew complicated. In many cases, the child was taken from her, and placed in another household. Raised at a distance, where the truth could be managed more easily. She might be allowed to see the child occasionally, or might lose all contact entirely, depending on the wishes of those controlling the situation. Even when she was permitted to remain nearby, she could not publicly acknowledge the child as her own. The secrecy that protected the nobleman demanded that she relinquish her role as mother in every visible sense. She watched from afar, carrying the weight of a life she helped create, but was not allowed to claim. Over time, these women faded from the networks that once defined their lives. A servant dismissed from court seldom found comparable employment again. A woman forced into marriage often struggled to build a life with a man chosen for convenience rather than compatibility. Poverty, insecurity, and social isolation shaped the remainder of their days. The court rarely offered support beyond what was necessary to maintain appearances. And once their usefulness ended, they became invisible to the world that had once dictated their every movement. Their stories exposed the deep imbalance in Tudor society, where power insulated men from accountability while condemning women to bear the consequences alone. The structures that governed court life were built to preserve male reputation at any cost, leaving women to navigate the aftermath with no authority to challenge the system. Each woman's disappearance from the palace reinforced the order that kept noble households intact. Their suffering remained unrecorded, overshadowed by the grandeur of the institutions they had once served. To understand their condition is to see the foundation of Tudor society stripped of ornament. It reveals a world that demanded silence from those who had no means to speak, and expected endurance from those denied the right to protest. These women survived in the margins, their identities shaped by decisions made by others, their futures determined by the need to protect men far above them. Their lives formed the quiet background of court life, a background the court relied upon but never acknowledged. Their experiences revealed how deeply a woman's fate depended on the protection she was denied. Their disappearances exposed the lengths households would go to preserve the appearance of order. Beyond the palace walls, the consequences of these hidden sacrifices were beginning to settle into the lives they left behind. Children who spent their earliest years within the walls of Tudor palaces lived in a world shaped by contradiction. Their surroundings suggested privilege. Stone halls, guarded chambers, and the quiet movement of servants who tended to the needs of the royal household. Yet these children belonged neither to the court nor to the families who controlled it. They occupied spaces filled with wealth, but were granted none of the certainty that wealth was meant to provide. Though they played near symbols of power, their lives unfolded under a constant pressure to remain unnoticed. Every moment of their existence depended on how carefully they could navigate the fragile balance between visibility and silence. Their presence was tolerated because it was unavoidable, but it was never celebrated. Servants who cared for them learned quickly that affection had boundaries. A misplaced comment or gesture could draw unwanted attention, and so care was delivered quietly and efficiently. Without acknowledgement of the truth, everyone understood but never voiced. The children absorbed this atmosphere long before they understood its meaning. They grew accustomed to being guided gently away from visiting nobles, redirected whenever officials arrived, and hushed whenever curiosity pushed them too close to forbidden spaces. Their earliest lessons revolved around caution. Rumors circulated in the background of palace life, but no one spoke openly about who these children resembled or why certain servants treated them with particular vigilance. A child's likeness to a member of the royal family could not be erased. Yet recognition was dangerous. Those who noticed such similarities learned to keep the observations to themselves. In a court where alliances shifted quickly and information could become a weapon, silence became the safest course. The child, meanwhile, lived with features that reflected a truth they were never encouraged to consider. Their activities were carefully monitored. They were allowed to move through certain halls, but not others. They could observe ceremonies from a distance, but were never permitted to stand among the families who shaped them. Meals were taken in modest chambers, with attendants instructed not to linger or engage in unnecessary conversation. When festivities filled the palace, these children remained out of sight, tucked away where laughter and music reached them only faintly through thick walls. The palace wanted them close enough to manage, yet far enough to ignore. Supervision extended into every aspect of their lives. Their education, if provided at all, remained limited and practical. They learned skills suited for modest household roles, not for participation in the world of inheritance and governance. This training ensured they remained useful but never influential. A child with royal blood might grow intelligent or capable, but such qualities mattered little when their existence threatened the legitimacy of those who held official titles. Their futures were shaped deliberately, narrowing their options long before they reached adulthood. As they grew older, the restrictions around them intensified. Curiosity became dangerous, and questions about their origins met with stern warnings or evasive responses. They often sensed truths that no one dared explain. Observing noble families interact, they recognized patterns and privileges that contrasted sharply with their own treatment. The court around them functioned with rigid logic. Legitimacy determined worth, and those without it were expected to accept their place quietly. The children learned to read expressions and tones, to understand which topics were safe and which would provoke unease. Awareness became a survival skill. The constant surveillance shaped their sense of self. Some internalized the belief that they were fortunate simply to exist within palace walls, never challenging the inequity of their situation. Others felt the tension more acutely, recognizing they lived close to authority without any claim to it. Their emotions, however, could not alter the structure that governed their lives. The court had little space for those who complicated the narrative of royal propriety. The safest path for such children was to remain invisible, blending into the routines of the household until they reached an age when relocation became necessary. When that moment arrived, they were often sent away quietly, placed in distant households, or apprenticed into trades. These transitions occurred without ceremony, documented only in minor accounts or in letters exchanged between officials who valued discretion. The separation served two purposes. It removed potential sources of scandal from the palace, and it reshaped the child into an adult whose past could be easily, their connection to the court dissolved, leaving behind only the faintest trace that they had ever lived within its walls. What remained for them was a life defined not by who they were, but by who they were not allowed to be. Their birth had positioned them close to a world that refused to acknowledge them, and their upbringing ensured they never challenged that boundary. They carried with them memories of halls they once walked, of doors that closed at their approach, and of caregivers who offered affection restrained by fear. These memories formed the quiet foundation of identities, shaped by absence rather than belonging. Their existence exposed a truth that the palace itself preferred to keep hidden. Its grandeur rested not only on ceremony and lineage, but also on the silent management of lives that did not fit into its polished image. The children lived in its shadows, molded by rules designed to limit their presence. They served as reminders that even the most powerful households harbored fractures behind their ordered facades. Fractures that were concealed, controlled, and never spoken aloud. Their restrained childhoods revealed how strictly the palace guarded the boundaries of legitimacy. Their monitored movements exposed the fear that surrounded their very existence. Outside the reach of those walls, the quiet consequences of their upbringing were beginning to shape futures they never chose. Children born in secrecy often found their earliest comfort not in the arms of their true mothers, but in the care of household servants who were instructed to assume responsibilities they could never speak of openly. These women existed at the lowest levels of Tudor hierarchy, yet they carried burdens that shaped the entire structure of noble life. When an illegitimate child needed to be hidden, it was the servants, those who moved quietly through the palace and understood its unspoken rules, who became the protectors of both the infant and the reputation of the household. Their participation ensured that the facade of order remained intact, even as they navigated consequences far heavier than those borne by the people they shielded. A servant entrusted with such a task faced an obligation layered with risk. She might be handed the infant immediately after birth, instructed to leave the estate without explanation, or relocated to a distant property where her continued service depended on absolute silence. No contract defined her role. No formal acknowledgement identified her involvement, and no promise guaranteed her safety. She understood instinctively that a single mistake, an incorrect answer, a misplaced gesture, a moment of emotional openness, could place her life and the child's future in danger. The task required composure, discipline, and a willingness to erase the truth from her daily language. These children grew up believing the servant was their natural guardian. She became the one constant in a life defined by concealment. Yet her relationship to the child remained constrained by the requirements of secrecy. She provided food, warmth, and comfort, but she also carried out the instructions of those who controlled their future. If the household demanded relocation, she obeyed. If the child needed to be distanced further from the court, she accompanied them. Her loyalty was expected, not negotiated, and any hesitation risked exposing the truth she had been ordered to protect. Many children never learned the identity of their father. The servant caring for them ensured that questions were redirected, curiosity discouraged, and suspicions softened through routine. The child grew accustomed to gaps in their history, accepting explanations crafted to keep them aligned with the life chosen for them. Some understood that their circumstances were unusual, but they lacked the context to interpret the quiet exchanges that passed between adults. The absence of knowing became a part of their daily existence, shaping a sense of self that relied more on survival than connection. The weight of this secrecy rested heavily on the servants involved. They lived within two realities, one in which they cared for a child with the tenderness they might offer their own, and another in which they acted under the constant threat of reprisal. Their status offered no protection. A nobleman could dismiss or punish them without consequence, and the information they possessed made them targets for suspicion should any rumor emerge. The hierarchy of the household ensured that their loyalty was expected but never rewarded. They were invisible caretakers, performing essential work in the shadows of families that relied on their obedience. Some servants assumed roles far more complicated than simple guardianship. When circumstances demanded deeper concealment, a woman might be instructed to raise the child as her own, fully adopting a fiction that dictated every part of her life. This act bound her permanently to the deception. It altered how she presented herself to her community, shaped the expectations placed on her, and controlled the child's perception of their identity. She navigated this arrangement with care, aware that revealing the truth, even unintentionally, could unravel the security built around the child's anonymity. The decisions made by these servants had lasting effects on the children they raised. A child raised in secrecy learned early to read caution in the movements of adults. They sensed the tension that surrounded certain topics, the reluctance to answer questions directly, and the abrupt hush that followed any mention of the court. Their upbringing formed a quiet discipline in them, teaching them to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Even without understanding the full truth, they lived with an inherited instinct for self-protection, shaped by the vigilance of the woman who watched over them. Despite the closeness formed between servant and child, the structure of Tudor society ensured that their connection remained unacknowledged. The noble household might provide minimal financial support or occasional guidance, but these gestures never altered the fundamental imbalance. The servant bore the emotional and practical burdens, while the noble family preserved its reputation. When the child eventually left the servant's care, whether to enter service, an apprenticeship, or a distant residence, the separation unfolded without ceremony. The truth of their shared life remained confined to unspoken memory. These arrangements reveal the extent to which noble households depended on servants, not only for labor, but for the preservation of social order. The system relied on the quiet endurance of women who possessed little power, yet held the most dangerous secrets. Their involvement ensured that the consequences of noble misconduct remained hidden, allowing the court to function smoothly despite the private realities it refused to acknowledge. They carried histories no one recorded, shaped lives no one recognized, and upheld reputations that would never protect them in return. Their hidden labor revealed how deeply the court depended on those it refused to see. Their silence exposed the fragile structure of households built on secrecy rather than truth. Beyond the confines of their service, the quiet results of their devotion continued to shape lives they had once been ordered to protect. The historical traces of illegitimate children within Tudor society appear not as clear records but as faint impressions scattered across documents never meant to preserve their stories. Their presence emerges in fragments, brief mentions in letters, marginal notes in household accounts, or cryptic references within correspondences that reveal more through omission than through detail. These children lived close to the centers of power, yet the written evidence of their existence was shaped by a deliberate effort to obscure, reduce, or erase. What survives today reflects the quiet strategies used by noble families to ensure that the past aligned with the image they wished to present. Most official documents avoided naming such children directly. Their births were rarely recorded in parish registers with any clarity, and when they were, the entries often concealed more than they revealed. A child might be listed under a common surname, with no indication of parentage, or identified only with a label signaling illegitimacy without further context. These minimal accounts served to satisfy administrative requirements while preventing any potential claim to noble lineage. The ambiguity was intentional. It protected families from future disputes and shielded reputations that depended on the appearance of moral order. Private correspondence provides slightly clearer glimpses, though even these letters reflect the cautious language of a society skilled at maneuvering around uncomfortable truths. A nobleman might refer to the matter we discussed or the child in the other household, never stating names or relationships outright. Financial records occasionally show payments made to caretakers or servants, but the purpose behind these transactions remains unstated. The lack of explicit detail is itself evidence of the effort to minimize recognition. The documents speak in muted tones, offering just enough information for historians to sense the shape of a hidden life without granting it full visibility. The obscured identities of these children shaped their understanding of themselves. Growing up, they encountered gaps in their personal histories, with no formal acknowledgement to explain those absences. They sensed that certain questions unsettled the adults around them, and they learned to suppress curiosity in order to maintain stability. Without access to records or recognition, they navigated life unaware of the connections that linked them to powerful families. Their lineage, though rooted in privilege, became unreachable, a truth buried beneath layers of caution and restraint. Some children bore names chosen specifically to avoid association with the families who created them. These names removed them from the genealogies that structured Tudor society, leaving them without a place in the histories that determined inheritance and status. Even when resemblance was undeniable, the written record remained silent. A nobleman could walk past a child whose features mirrored his own, without fear that a document would confirm what the eye could see. The written silence served as a shield, protecting those who benefited from the existing order while denying any path to recognition for those excluded from it. The broader social system reinforced this ambiguity. Record-keeping in Tudor England varied by region and by the diligence of local officials, creating opportunities for selective omission. A birth might go unrecorded entirely if the household preferred it so. A child might be baptized under an assumed name. A midwife or priest might be instructed to produce incomplete or vague entries that revealed nothing beyond the fact that an infant had entered the world. These methods created a historical landscape in which truth was present but indistinct, preserved only through indirect hints. Over time, the gaps in documentation shaped the trajectory of many lives. Without proof of lineage, these children had no legal means to claim inheritance, protection, or status. Their existence remained peripheral, acknowledged privately but unrecognized publicly. They matured into adults whose identities rested on narratives constructed for convenience rather than accuracy. Their children and grandchildren inherited the same uncertainty, with stories passed down orally rather than through records. Entire family lines drifted into obscurity, disconnected from origins that would never be documented formally. The few surviving references serve as quiet reminders of lives shaped by institutional erasure. A single line in a letter, a notation in an account book, or a cryptic reference in legal correspondence can suggest the presence of a child whose name was never intended to endure. These fragments demonstrate how carefully noble families controlled their histories, shaping what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. The documents that survive today reflect not only the truth of the past, but the deliberate absence of it. To read these records is to confront the limits of historical memory. The official accounts of Tudor England present a world of orderly succession and moral discipline. Yet beneath these narratives lie stories deliberately pushed aside. The children who moved quietly through this system left behind traces that resist clarity, echoes of lives lived in the margins of a society unwilling to acknowledge them fully. Their historical presence is defined not by what was written, but by what was withheld. Their fragmented record revealed how thoroughly the past could be shaped by those with the power to control it. Their obscured names exposed the narrow boundaries of a history built on selective memory. Across these faint documents, the muted consequences of their erasure continued to influence lives far removed from the courts that once concealed them. The place of illegitimate children within Tudor society was shaped not only by law and custom, but also by the authority of the Church, whose influence extended into every aspect of birth, identity, and legitimacy. For these children, the absence of proper baptism or official documentation created a void that defined their lives from the beginning. A baptism recorded incorrectly, or not recorded at all, meant more than a missing entry in a parish book. It signified the denial of spiritual recognition, social belonging, and the minimal legitimacy required to navigate Tudor England. In a world where faith and governance intertwined, the Church's silence became another barrier these children could never overcome. Baptism served as the threshold into both religious and civic existence. Most families ensured the ritual occurred quickly after birth, securing the child's place within the Christian community. But for children born from concealed relationships, this step was often delayed, obscured, or manipulated. Some were baptized privately by clergy, instructed to omit details or disguise the mother's identity. Others were rushed through ceremonies held outside normal parish oversight, leaving no clear record of their entry into the world. In extreme cases, the baptism never occurred. Without that ritual, the child existed spiritually and socially in a state of suspension, neither acknowledged nor openly rejected, merely unrecorded. The Church's stance on extramarital relations shaped much of this secrecy. It viewed such unions as moral failures that needed containment rather than confrontation. Priests were expected to uphold the sanctity of marriage, yet they were often placed in the position of facilitating silence through ambiguous record-keeping. While some clergy expressed discomfort with the practice, many complied out of obligation to the noble families who supported their parishes or held influence over their positions. This institutional cooperation allowed the concealment of illegitimate births to become a routine, if unspoken, aspect of Tudor religious life. For children dependent on the Church's recognition, the consequences were profound. Without baptismal confirmation, they could not easily claim kinship, legitimacy, or even basic parish rights. Their futures narrowed from the outset, shaped by an absence of documentation that followed them through adulthood. Even when baptisms were formally recorded, the entries often reduced the mother to a generic label and erased the father. The child's connection to any noble lineage was deliberately severed, leaving no trace that might challenge the existing social order. When acknowledgement did occur, It required intervention from the highest levels. A king or archbishop could override local resistance, granting recognition that allowed an illegitimate child to enter public life in limited ways. Such cases, however, were exceptional. They depended on political convenience, personal favor, or the need to advance strategic alliances. Even with high-level approval, the child's status remained fragile. Acknowledgement did not confer full legitimacy, nor did it grant rights of inheritance. It simply allowed the child to be visible without threatening the structures that protected noble families. The process of obtaining recognition revealed the deep tension between religious doctrine and political necessity. The Church preached moral order, yet it also served the interests of the powerful. A nobleman, seeking to conceal a child, found willing cooperation from clergy eager to avoid conflict. Conversely, when a king sought to elevate an illegitimate offspring for strategic purposes, church officials produced the necessary documents with equal willingness. This flexibility exposed the extent to which the authority of the church could bend under social pressure, contradicting the moral rigidity it claimed to uphold. For most illegitimate children, these complexities remained invisible but influential. They grew up aware that something about their origins set them apart, yet unable to name the exact boundary they could not cross. Clergy who baptized them did not explain the omissions in their records. Parish officers who noted their presence did so with minimal detail, marking them with labels that carried lifelong consequences. The silence surrounding their birth shaped not only their social standing, but also their sense of belonging within the religious community that governed daily life. Women who bore these children also faced the weight of the Church's judgment. Their confessions were shaped by pressure, fear, and the knowledge that the moral framework surrounding them offered no understanding of the power imbalances involved. They lived with the stigma of sin, while the men who fathered their children continued to participate in religious rituals without consequence. The Church's treatment of illegitimacy thus reinforced the broader structures of inequality that defined Tudor society, placing responsibility on those least able to resist. Over time, the accumulation of vague entries, missing records, and ambiguous baptisms produced a historical landscape marked by uncertainty. The Church, though central to Tudor identity, became a silent collaborator in the erasure of illegitimate lives. Its documents, meant to preserve truth across generations, instead preserved only shadows. For historians, these shadows reveal the scale of exclusion. For the children who lived within them, they represented the limits of recognition in a society governed by lineage, morality, and institutional silence. Their absent records revealed how easily faith could be used to conceal rather than acknowledge. Their unnamed identities exposed the narrow space the Church allowed for those born outside sanctioned unions. Through the blurred margins of parish books, the quiet consequences of this silence continued to shape lives confined by rules they never chose. Monasteries in Tudor England served not only as religious communities, but also as quiet repositories for the unwanted consequences of noble indiscretions. Children born from concealed relationships were sometimes placed within these institutions at an age too young to form memories, carried there by attendants under strict instruction to speak to no one about the child's origins. The process unfolded without ceremony, reflecting a system designed to remove scandal rather than resolve it. Once inside the monastery walls, the child's life merged into a routine shaped by discipline, silence, and isolation, far removed from the families whose reputations they had been ordered to protect. For the nobles involved, sending a child to a religious house offered a convenient solution. Monasteries provided food, shelter, and structure, and their distance from public life ensured that the child would not inadvertently reappear in the social world the parents inhabited. The decision required no public acknowledgement, no written statement, and no burden beyond the occasional donation to ensure the child's continued care. Such payments appeared in household accounts under vague descriptions, Hidden among routine expenses, the monastery accepted the child without question, understanding that discretion was an expected part of its service to the surrounding nobility. Inside these institutions, the children grew up in an environment defined by order rather than affection. Their daily lives consisted of prayer, study, and labor, following schedules shaped by tradition rather than individual need. They learned early that personal identity mattered less than obedience. The adults around them, monks, nuns, or lay workers, provided structure but not explanations. The children were raised as members of the religious community, unaware that their presence reflected decisions made elsewhere. Decisions intended to conceal rather than nurture. Their world was stable but narrow, bounded by walls that limited contact with the outside. The isolation shaped their perception of themselves. Many never questioned why they had no memories of family or why no relatives ever visited. Within the monastery, such absence was not unusual. Many children of the poor also lived there due to hardship. But the illegitimate children of nobles carried a difference they could not name. Their lives were not the result of misfortune, but of deliberate separation. The secrecy surrounding their origins created a silence that followed them through their formative years, leaving them without the context needed to understand their place in the broader world. Opportunities for leaving the monastery were rare. Some children took vows as adults, not because they chose religious life, but because they lacked the means or knowledge to pursue alternatives. Others remained as workers, contributing labor to the community without ever attaining the authority of those who had chosen the monastic path. A few were allowed to leave for apprenticeships or service, but only when arrangements could be made that ensured their origins remained unspoken. Their futures depended on the institution's willingness to release them, a decision shaped more by practicality than by individual merit. For many, the truth of their birth was never revealed. They lived entire lives without knowing that their presence in the monastery resulted from the needs of noble households to avoid scandal. The nobles who had engineered their placement rarely attempted contact. Acknowledging the child after so many years risked exposing the very secret the placement was meant to obscure. Thus, the children remained disconnected from the world that had shaped their existence. The monastery became their only home, and its routines replaced the familial ties denied to them at birth. The emotional consequences of this arrangement were difficult to trace. Hidden behind the uniformity of monastic life, some children adapted easily, finding stability in the structure and continuity of religious practice. Others sensed an unexplained absence, a lack of belonging that lingered even as they grew into adulthood. Without names that linked them to families or records that documented their origins, they became individuals without history. Their identities were shaped by gaps that could never be filled because the documents that might have explained those absences were deliberately vague or non-existent. The practice of placing illegitimate children in monasteries also revealed the moral contradictions of Tudor society. Religious institutions preached compassion and community, yet they participated in the concealment of noble misconduct by accepting children without question. Nobles who condemned moral failings in others used these same institutions to hide the consequences of their own actions. The Church, which emphasized redemption, became a tool for maintaining appearances. The children themselves bore the cost, living lives shaped by decisions rooted in convenience rather than care. Over time, these hidden placements contributed to a larger pattern of erasure. The monasteries kept records, but the entries noted births, placements, or donations in ways that obscured connections to the outside world. These documents reveal the presence of children, but not the circumstances that led them there. The institutions preserved their physical lives, but erased their personal histories, leaving modern readers with only scattered clues. The children, meanwhile, grew into adults whose origins remained unknown even to themselves. Their lives shaped by a silence they never chose. Their confined upbringing revealed how easily religious institutions could become instruments of concealment. Their absence from public life exposed the quiet cooperation between nobles and the church in maintaining order. Within the stillness of monastic walls, the unseen cost of protecting reputations continued to shape lives left without a past. Within Tudor society, a name was more than a label. It was the foundation upon which identity, inheritance, and legitimacy were built. For many illegitimate children connected to noble bloodlines, the absence of a recognized name meant the absence of a place in the world. Their lives unfolded in the shadow of families that shaped the nation's history. Yet they themselves remained unrecorded, unidentified, and unacknowledged. Without a surname tied to lineage or land, they existed on the margins of a system that prized ancestry above all else. Their anonymity was not an accident. It was an instrument of control designed to prevent claims, challenge narratives, or unsettle the delicate structure of noble inheritance. The withholding of a name functioned as both a shield and a weapon. For noble families, it protected reputations and prevented complications that might arise from recognizing a child born outside marriage. For the children, it imposed a form of erasure that followed them throughout their lives. A child without a family name had no legitimate claim to property, rank, or support. They could not enter certain professions, secure meaningful patronage, or marry advantageously. Even their social interactions were marked by the question of origins, a question they could never answer truthfully because the truth had been denied to them. In daily life, this absence shaped their interactions with both strangers and authorities. A child asked to identify themselves would offer only a given name, one that revealed nothing of lineage or expectation. Parish records listed them in generic terms, often with descriptors that emphasized illegitimacy rather than individuality. Their lives were documented in fragments, if at all, leaving future generations to speculate about their backgrounds. This obscurity was a deliberate design, ensuring that these children could not later reappear to challenge the established order or demand the recognition they were denied. The emotional impact of namelessness cannot be understated. A child growing up without a surname learned early that they occupied a space outside the accepted structure of society. They sensed the boundaries others took for granted. Their friendships, education, and prospects unfolded under the weight of an unnamed absence, a silence that sometimes grew heavier with age. They developed identities formed not from heritage, but from circumstance, shaped by those willing to provide shelter or employment. Their personal histories remained incomplete, defined as much by what was withheld as by what was known. Name and inheritance were inseparable in Tudor England. The legitimacy of claims rested on documented lineage, and a name was the key that unlocked legal pathways. Without it, even the suggestion of noble blood offered no practical advantage. A child possessing the features or mannerisms of a noble family could still be dismissed as irrelevant if lacking formal recognition. The system allowed nobles to benefit from these children when convenient, by placing them in service roles, using them as intermediaries, or arranging favourable marriages that reinforced alliances, while preventing them from threatening the structure of succession. King Henry VIII's recognition of Henry Fitzroy stands as an unusual exception, not a model. For every acknowledged illegitimate child, dozens remained unnamed, unseen, and unrecorded. Their exclusion preserved the appearance of order in a world shaped by political calculation. Acknowledging them formally risked unravelling carefully constructed genealogies and reopening inheritance disputes. By denying them names, the nobility ensured these potential complications never emerged. For many, adulthood brought no clarity. Opportunities remained limited, and their social position was defined not by talent or behaviour, but by the documentation they lacked. Employers, patrons, and parish officials made decisions based on assumptions rather than facts, reinforcing boundaries the child could not cross. Some found stability in manual trades or religious institutions, where origins mattered less. Others drifted through temporary work. Unable to establish the long-term connections necessary for security, they navigated a world that recognized them only as individuals, without pasts, without claims, and without the means to demand more. The silence surrounding their identities also created fertile ground for rumors. Some illegitimate children became the subjects of whispered speculation, their mannerisms or physical traits prompting conjecture about their parentage. Such rumors rarely benefited them. Without documentation, they could neither confirm nor refute any claim. The whispers served mainly to reinforce their exclusion, reminding them and others that they stood close to power yet could never touch it. In later years, these children often attempted to reconstruct their origins, searching through parish records, interviewing elders, or piecing together cryptic remarks overheard in childhood. Their investigations typically led nowhere. The records designed to obscure their identities had succeeded, leaving only fragments that hinted at connections they could never verify. Their inability to claim a name, one that should have tied them to estates, titles, or legacies, remained a lifelong wound. The absence shaped not only their own lives, but the lives of their descendants, who inherited the same silence. Tudor society valued order, legitimacy, and a clearly defined hierarchy. In this system, illegitimate children served as reminders of transgressions the nobility wished to forget. By denying them names, the system rendered them invisible without resorting to open cruelty. They were permitted to live, but not to belong. Permitted to serve, but not to stand beside those whose blood they shared. Their existence illuminated the contradictions of a society that championed moral discipline, while quietly constructing mechanisms to conceal its own failings. Their unnamed identities revealed how deliberately society controlled the boundaries of lineage. Their obscured lives exposed the cost of preserving order in a world shaped by inheritance and denial. Within the shadows cast by noble households, the quiet consequences of namelessness continued to unfold in lives built on absence. Children born from concealed noble relationships were sometimes removed not just from their households but from the entire realm, sent away before they could speak, remember, or form any sense of belonging. Their departures unfolded quietly, escorted by servants, midwives, or paid intermediaries who understood the necessity of silence. These journeys were not acts of care, but acts of preservation, designed to protect the reputations of families who valued appearance above responsibility. A child carried across borders at a few months old became, by design, a life erased from the landscape that had produced them. Distance, rather than secrecy alone, became the ultimate tool for ensuring they would never return to challenge the order that defined Tudor society. The motives behind these removals varied, but shared a common logic. A noble household wishing to prevent gossip found that relocating the child solved the problem more efficiently than hiding them within domestic or religious institutions. Foreign destinations offered anonymity that no English monastery or foster home could guarantee. In another country, the child's origins dissolved into unfamiliar languages, customs, and parish systems. A new identity could be constructed with ease, leaving behind no trace that tied them to the aristocratic bloodlines from which they came. The act was both practical and final. Once the child crossed the shoreline, their connection to England and to their parentage faded into obscurity. Many children were placed into households of lower status, either formally adopted or taken in as labourers. These families accepted the arrangement for financial compensation or out of allegiance to intermediaries who facilitated such placements. The children grew up believing they belonged to the families that raised them, unaware that their lineage carried noble ties. In some cases, their new homes provided stability and affection. In others, the children were treated as outsiders, useful for labour, but excluded from the intimacy of family life. Their English origins became little more than a detail mentioned in passing, a curiosity without context. Marriage was another path used to secure their removal. Some illegitimate children, particularly girls, were arranged into early unions abroad, where lineage mattered less than utility. These marriages served diplomatic, commercial, or social purposes, enabling noble families to dispose of potential complications while appearing generous. The child, unaware of their true origins, entered a marriage shaped by negotiations they never witnessed, their life course determined by the need to maintain silence rather than by choice or aspiration. The foreign environment ensured they could not seek answers, even if they sensed an absence in their history. As the children grew into adulthood, the truth remained unreachable. They encountered questions about their origins, but the gaps in their past were too wide to fill. Those who sensed inconsistencies in their upbringing had no path to uncovering the truth. Letters that might have revealed their placement were destroyed. Servants who had escorted them across the sea never spoke of their tasks. The noble families who had orchestrated their removal continued their lives without acknowledging the existence of the children they had sent away. For the exiled individuals, identity became a story built on silence. The psychological impact of such removals persisted long after childhood. Many felt a quiet dislocation, a sense that their earliest memories were shrouded in fog. Their accent, mannerisms, or appearance sometimes differed subtly from those around them, prompting questions they could not answer. In foreign towns and villages, they lived as part of the community, yet slightly apart from it, their origins both invisible and inescapable. Some embraced their adopted homes, finding belonging through effort and endurance. Others carried a persistent feeling of displacement, a sense of having come from somewhere they could never name. The noble families who facilitated these departures rarely acknowledged them, even privately. Correspondence between nobles occasionally hints at such arrangements, using coded phrases or obscure references that reveal the existence of the practice without identifying individuals. These documents show a calculated detachment. The child was not seen as a person to be mourned or remembered, but as a potential conflict successfully avoided. Removal provided a definitive solution. Once abroad, the child posed no threat to inheritance, reputation, or political stability. The nobles continued their lives, secure in the knowledge that the past had been carried far away. For the children themselves, the consequences extended into future generations. Their descendants inherited stories that lacked clarity, shaped by guesses rather than facts. Family traditions might include references to an English origin, but the details were fragmented, distorted by time and omission. The absence of documentation made it impossible to connect these individuals to the broader structures of Tudor society. Their place in history remained undefined, existing only in the spaces left behind by those who had chosen distance over acknowledgement. The practice of sending children abroad reveals a darker aspect of the Tudor social order. Geography became a means of erasure, transforming human lives into solvable problems. The journey across the sea symbolized a deliberate severing of ties, a physical expression of denial, while the children built new lives. The families who sent them away preserved their own standing through the quiet removal of anything that threatened their carefully constructed narratives. Their distant lives revealed how far nobles would go to preserve appearances. Their hidden origins exposed the quiet cruelty woven into decisions presented as necessity. Across foreign shores, the silent weight of erased histories continued to anchor the paths they were forced to follow. As illegitimate children approached adolescence, their existence shifted from a quiet inconvenience to a potential threat. A young child posed little danger to noble households, but an older one, capable of recognizing resemblances, asking questions, or understanding inheritance, could unravel carefully maintained secrecy. In Tudor society, where power depended on lineage and reputation, the mere possibility that such a child might seek acknowledgement created tension. What had once been tolerated as a hidden consequence of an affair became a vulnerability, and the measures taken to address that vulnerability grew darker as the child matured. Whispers of unfortunate illness circulated with unsettling frequency in certain households. A child who had lived quietly for years suddenly collapsed after a meal. Another fell ill without explanation, their decline rapid enough to prevent inquiry. These incidents were framed as tragedies. Yet those familiar with noble politics recognized the pattern. Poison offered a discreet solution. It required no public confrontation, left little trace, and allowed the household to present the death as a natural affliction. For a system prioritizing stability over integrity, such methods preserved appearances while eliminating risk. The danger intensified for children who displayed curiosity. A simple question about parentage could trigger alarm among household stewards or members of the noble family. Servants instructed to maintain silence understood that even a small disclosure could cost them their positions. Or worse, when a child asked too persistently, they were often relocated, isolated, or abruptly placed into service elsewhere. Those who refused to stop searching sometimes vanished entirely. Their absence was explained through convenient narratives: a journey gone wrong, a plague outbreak, or a tragic accident. The truth rarely left the walls of the estate. Mothers of these children lived under constant surveillance. For noblemen, secrecy was essential for the women involved. Silence determined survival. Even long after the child had been separated from her, a mother carried the burden of knowledge. Her life unfolded under the unspoken threat that any hint of the truth might provoke punishment. Some were married off to distant households to ensure they remained quiet. Others were dismissed from service with warnings that left no room for ambiguity. A few who dared to speak were subjected to harsher measures: public humiliation, confinement, or disappearances framed as moral correction. The power imbalance ensured that their attempts to protect or reconnect with their children placed them in jeopardy. The broader community rarely questioned these events. Tudor society accepted sudden illness and early death as common realities. Disease spread quickly in both rural and urban environments, and mortality rates provided convenient cover. A child dying at 12 or 14 raised little suspicion, even when circumstances aligned too neatly with private tensions. Clergy performed burial rites without probing. Officials recorded deaths without investigation. The lack of institutional scrutiny allowed such patterns to continue unchecked, enabling noble households to erase complications through methods hidden behind the facade of everyday misfortune. At times, the threat emerged not from the noble family, but from individuals seeking to curry favor with them. Servants or rivals eager to prove loyalty sometimes acted independently, eliminating a child they perceived as a danger to the household's reputation. These acts, though unsanctioned, often went unpunished because they served the interests of those in power. The ambiguity surrounding responsibility ensured that no one could be openly blamed, while the intended outcome, a silenced question, a removed threat, was quietly achieved. For surviving children, adulthood brought its own risks. Those who began to suspect their origins faced difficult decisions. Seeking answers could lead them into conflict with individuals who saw their inquiries as destabilizing. A chance resemblance to a nobleman, a whispered comment from an aging servant, or a half-forgotten childhood memory might spark a desire for truth. Yet pursuing that truth could place them in the path of those determined to maintain silence. Some adults who searched for their past disappeared without explanation, their stories swallowed by a system designed to protect privilege above all else. The emotional toll of living under such shadowed danger shaped their lives in profound ways. Many learned to suppress curiosity, understanding instinctively that their questions brought discomfort or fear. They carried a sense of unease, a feeling that their identity contained something forbidden. Even without explicit threats, the atmosphere surrounding them communicated the risks. They moved cautiously through social spaces, aware that their ignorance served the interests of others. Their silence became both a survival strategy and a burden. These patterns reveal a darker logic within Tudor society, when reputation was vital and inheritance absolute. Protecting the structure of noble power justified extreme measures. Violence became a tool of preservation. Lives were judged not for their humanity, but for their potential to disrupt order. The nameless and unacknowledged carried danger simply by existing. And the solutions devised to control that danger reflected the ruthlessness embedded within the era's social hierarchy. For historians, the absence of documentation on these disappearances speaks as loudly as surviving records. The lack of investigations, the vague causes of death, and the unchallenged narratives of misfortune all point to a system that relied on silence. These children, whose lives began in secrecy, often ended in obscurity. Shaped by the same forces, their stories remained faint, detectable only in the inconsistencies left behind by those who sought to erase them. Their vanishing lives revealed how fiercely power guarded its boundaries. Their unanswered questions exposed the fear hidden behind noble stability. Through the quiet gaps in recorded history, the consequences of silencing them continued to echo through generations that never learned their names. As children born on the margins of noble households grew older, some found themselves drawn into the dangerous currents of court politics, not by choice, but by the circumstances of their birth. Their ambiguous identities made them useful to those seeking information, while their lack of official status ensured they could be disavowed if anything went wrong. In the Tudor world, knowledge was leverage, and acquiring it often required eyes and ears that passed unnoticed. Illegitimate children, already skilled at navigating silence and invisibility, became convenient instruments for gathering secrets that others could not obtain openly. The recruitment of such children into informal espionage rarely resembled structured training. Instead, it emerged gradually, shaped by whispered requests, subtle expectations, and the quiet pressures placed upon those who could not refuse. A mother confined by circumstance might rely on her child to observe movements within the household. A rival servant might encourage the child to listen outside doors or repeat conversations heard during errands. Nobles seeking advantage in court did not hesitate to exploit these children's access, using them to monitor alliances, rivalries, or potential scandals. Each task appeared small, yet the risks attached to them grew with every secret delivered. The children often misunderstood the seriousness of their roles. Many believed they were simply helping those who fed, clothed, or sheltered them. Their loyalty, shaped by gratitude or fear, made them easy to manipulate. They carried messages, repeated overheard remarks, or reported encounters they did not fully comprehend. Yet in the charged environment of court and household politics, even a fragment of information could spark conflict or expose hidden tensions. The child who delivered such knowledge rarely understood the consequences that followed, nor the degree to which their involvement placed them in danger. When secrets unraveled or conspiracies came to light, these children became the most vulnerable participants. Their lack of protection meant they could be blamed without hesitation. A nobleman implicated in wrongdoing could distance himself by accusing the child of misunderstanding or fabricating events. A servant facing punishment might sacrifice the child to save themselves. In more severe cases, the child was simply removed, dismissed from service, relocated without explanation, or found dead under circumstances described as misfortune. Their disposability ensured that more powerful figures could escape scrutiny while presenting the incident as an unfortunate accident. The emotional burden placed on these children grew silently. They learned to navigate competing loyalties to the parent who needed them, to the household that employed them, and to the unspoken fear that any misstep could lead to punishment. Their daily routines were shaped by watching rather than belonging, by listening rather than speaking. Over time, they became adept at perceiving tension within rooms, recognizing coded exchanges, and identifying which truths were safe to repeat. Yet these skills, born from necessity, isolated them further. They lived with the knowledge that their usefulness defined their worth. Some children attempted to withdraw from these roles, sensing the danger more sharply as they matured, but stepping away rarely protected them. Those who had benefited from their information feared the possibility of exposure. A child who knew too much was more threatening than one who knew nothing at all. Efforts to distance themselves could provoke suspicion, leading to intensified oversight or removal under the guise of discipline. The very qualities that made them effective, quiet presence, careful observation, unnoticed mobility, made them easy targets once perceived as liabilities. The secrecy surrounding their use as spies ensured that few records survived. Official documents mention nothing of their involvement. Correspondence omits names, referencing only the boy or the girl in ways that reveal function without identity. Their stories survive in hints, sudden dismissals, unexplained deaths, or shifts in household structure that align too neatly with political upheavals. The absence of clear evidence reflects not only the covert nature of their tasks, but the deliberate erasure of individuals considered expendable. For the children themselves, the long-term effects were profound. Some carried into adulthood a heightened awareness of danger, a constant expectation that trust could shift without warning. Others, shaped by years of serving as unseen observers, struggled to form stable relationships, having learned that every interaction might hide ulterior motives. Their lives unfolded under the shadow of experiences they were never permitted to articulate. The silence they maintained in childhood became a pattern that persisted long after they left the households that once controlled them. The practice of using illegitimate children as spies reveals the ruthlessness inherent in Tudor power structures. It demonstrates how readily vulnerability could be exploited, how childhood could be transformed into a tool, and how secrecy functioned as a currency traded by those seeking advantage. These children, already burdened by the ambiguity of their origins, became instruments in conflicts they could neither understand nor escape. Their involvement illuminated the darker corners of a society where survival often depended on silence. Their unwilling roles revealed how easily innocence could be turned into leverage. Their fragile loyalties exposed the dangers woven into even the smallest acts of observation. Along with the hidden exchanges they carried, the quiet cost of serving unseen continued to shape lives, bound to secrets they never chose. For some illegitimate children of Tudor nobles, invisibility did not last forever. Their existence, once treated as a liability to be concealed, could suddenly become useful when political tensions shifted. In moments of need, alliances faltering, rivals gaining strength, or diplomatic pathways closing, noblemen sometimes reached for the very children they had spent years denying. Recognition, withheld for so long, could be offered abruptly when it served a concrete purpose. These children, unaware of the calculations shaping their fate, were drawn into political strategies designed not to acknowledge their humanity, but to leverage their blood. Such acknowledgement often took the form of calculated reintegration. A nobleman might present his illegitimate child as a symbol of goodwill, using the child's presence to solidify alliances with families of lower rank. A daughter could be offered in marriage to secure loyalty. A son might receive a minor position within a household or estate to signal favor. These gestures carried the appearance of generosity, yet their true purpose lay in the advantages they provided. The child's identity became a bargaining chip, valuable only as long as it served a broader objective. For the children, these transitions were abrupt and disorienting. A life spent in quiet obscurity, perhaps in foster care, in service, or within a monastery, could shift overnight with a summons they never expected. Suddenly, They were dressed, displayed, and introduced as belonging to a family that had never acknowledged them. The recognition, though flattering on the surface, brought unfamiliar expectations. They were asked to perform gratitude, obedience, and loyalty toward individuals who had shaped their lives from a distance. Their names, status, and roles were adjusted not to reflect truth, but to support strategies far beyond their control. The newfound inclusion seldom lasted. Once the political arrangement was complete, once alliances were secured, debts paid, or conflicts resolved, the child's usefulness quickly diminished. The nobleman who had claimed them might withdraw attention as readily as he had offered it. Promised opportunities failed to materialize. Positions granted in haste were quietly revoked. In some cases, the child was returned to obscurity without explanation. In others, they were left in limbo, neither fully accepted nor openly rejected. The change in treatment exposed the transactional nature of their recognition. They were valuable only for as long as they could be used. For daughters, the consequences were often permanent. A marriage arranged to serve political aims typically placed them in households where they carried no affection, no protection, and no understanding of the forces that had shaped their placement. Their husbands might treat them with suspicion or indifference, aware that their presence served external goals. Their children, born into these unions, inherited the uncertainty of origins that had defined their mothers' early lives. The cycle of ambiguous identity echoed across generations, perpetuating the instability created by a father's strategic decisions. Sons experienced a different but equally fraught path. Some received minor appointments in local governance or estates, yet these roles were fragile, subject to revocation if the nobleman's priorities changed. Others were drawn into military service, valued for their willingness to demonstrate loyalty in ways that legitimate heirs could avoid. Their contributions were rarely rewarded. Advancement required patronage, and patronage depended on recognition that their fathers seldom maintained. When fortunes shifted, these sons often found themselves dismissed or replaced, left with nothing but the brief illusion of belonging. Emotionally, the impact of this conditional acknowledgement was profound. The child who had once wondered about their origins now faced the painful realization that their parents' interest was driven not by affection, but by strategy. They were seen not as individuals, but as instruments, flexible, replaceable, and expendable. Their attempts to form genuine connections often failed, blocked by the distance their fathers maintained and the resentment or discomfort felt by legitimate heirs. Isolation deepened even in moments of apparent elevation. As the child sensed the fragility of their position, the political usefulness of illegitimate children also placed them in danger. If alliances collapsed, if secrets emerged, or if accusations circulated, these children were easy targets. A nobleman could protect legitimate heirs by sacrificing the illegitimate child first, framing them as the cause of failure or the source of betrayal. Their ambiguous status made them vulnerable to imprisonment, exile, or even execution under charges that required little evidence. Their fathers, committed above all to the preservation of their own power, seldom intervened. These patterns reveal the instrumental logic that governed Tudor politics. Blood mattered, but only in ways that served immediate goals. The existence of these children highlighted the hypocrisy of a system that prized lineage yet exploited those who shared it. Their identities were shaped not by personal history, but by the shifting needs of men whose choices determined their futures. Recognition came not as justice but as strategy. Abandonment followed, not as punishment, but as expedience. For historians, the traces of these individuals appear sporadically. In marriage agreements, small grants, or brief mentions in correspondence. These glimpses illuminate the moments when they were useful. Yet the silence that follows speaks even louder. Once their purpose was fulfilled, they returned to the shadows, their lives continuing without the support or acknowledgement briefly granted to them. Their stories reflect the instability of identity in a world where even blood ties were subject to political calculation. Their shifting status revealed how thoroughly power determined the meaning of kinship. Their conditional inclusion exposed the indifference behind gestures framed as generosity. Across the fragile bonds they were forced to accept, the quiet consequences of being used rather than recognized continued to shape the lives they never chose. In the private spaces of Tudor households, where silence carried as much weight as spoken words, some illegitimate children grew up not as hidden threats or political tools, but as burdens, quietly managed by those who claimed responsibility for them. Their lives unfolded at the intersection of duty, fear, and indifference. A father might acknowledge their existence only long enough to ensure they cause no disruption. A mother might love them deeply yet be denied any right to protect or raise them openly. Society, meanwhile, treated them as reminders of moral failure, living evidence of a transgression everyone preferred to forget. These children, caught between avoidance and exploitation, learned early that affection was not guaranteed, and that their presence demanded constant justification. The father's view shaped much of their fate. In noble households, a man who fathered an illegitimate child outside marriage approached the situation not with tenderness, but with calculation. The child represented a risk, a potential claim, a possible scandal, an unpredictable presence that might complicate alliances or disrupt orderly inheritance. Managing this risk required distance. Fathers arranged placements, issued payments, or dictated instructions, all while maintaining the emotional detachment that allowed them to pretend the child's existence had no bearing on their own. If the child remained quiet, compliant, and invisible, the arrangement succeeded. If they displayed curiosity or ambition, the father saw not a human being, but a problem that required sharper boundaries. Mothers, by contrast, carried a different burden. Their love for the child existed in tension with the fear imposed upon them. Many were servants, ladies in waiting, or lower-ranking women whose survival depended on obedience. To show affection risked exposure, to seek acknowledgement risked punishment. Thus, maternal love took the form of small gestures, pressing a blanket into a caretaker's hands, whispering reassurances during hurried visits, or lingering at distances where they might glimpse the child without being seen. These women lived with a constant ache, the knowledge that they could neither claim nor protect what their hearts recognized as theirs. Their silence, too, became an act of preservation. Meanwhile, society judged these children before they could speak. Neighbours, servants, and clergy treated them as stains upon household honour. Their origins were whispered about but never addressed directly. They were excluded from gatherings, watched more closely than their peers, and assigned tasks or roles intended to limit their visibility. Even when treated with politeness, the politeness carried caution, as though proximity to them might awaken a scandal better left dormant. The children absorbed this atmosphere instinctively. Long before they understood the meaning of legitimacy, they recognized the discomfort that followed them. In everyday life, affection came inconsistently, if at all. Some caretakers extended kindness, offering the warmth others withheld. These gestures, however sincere, could not resolve the larger structure surrounding the child. They lived inside a system that valued them only when useful. Their attempts to seek reassurance often met with evasive answers. Questions about lineage were redirected or dismissed. Any desire for belonging risked being interpreted as ambition, a threat that adults responded to with suspicion. Thus, the children learned to protect themselves emotionally, creating distance where others had already placed it. Their usefulness determined the opportunities granted to them. A child talented in reading or arithmetic might be placed into clerical training. One skilled in manners or observation might be assigned to serve in a noble household. Those seen as unsuitable were sent to labor, to monasteries, or to distant relatives willing to accept payment. Their paths were dictated not by personal potential, but by the needs of those managing them. Affection had no place in these decisions. Efficiency guided every choice. The psychological cost of being treated as an object rather than a person shaped their development. Many grew adept at suppressing emotion, understanding that vulnerability invited reprimand. They avoided drawing attention to themselves, choosing quiet corner spaces or shadowed hallways where they could exist without intrusion. Their relationships were cautious, marked by the awareness that attachment could be used against them. Trust, once broken, rarely reformed. Some children retreated inward, building identities around resilience rather than connection. Others internalized the rejection, believing themselves unworthy of care. The disparity between the father's cold detachment and the mother's hidden love created an emotional landscape defined by contradiction. The child sensed affection but lacked access to it. They sensed authority but received no protection from it. This imbalance left them suspended between two worlds, neither acknowledged nor abandoned, neither embraced nor expelled. Their existence reflected the moral ambiguity of Tudor society, which condemned the circumstances of their birth while exploiting the results. As they grew older, these children confronted the stark truth that their value depended on silence and compliance. If they served without question, they might secure stability. If they sought recognition, they risked erasure. The choice, if it could be called a choice, revealed how deeply the system relied on their inability to resist the role assigned to them. Survival required adapting to expectations that denied their humanity. Historians, searching for traces of these children, rarely find more than brief references. Their lives, though shaped by powerful people, left a minimal record. The emotional realities they endured, the longing, isolation, and unspoken grief, are absent from official documents. Yet these silences speak volumes. They reveal a world that used children to maintain appearances, protect status, and navigate political uncertainty, all while refusing to acknowledge the harm inflicted upon them. Their muted lives revealed how easily a child could be viewed as an obligation rather than a kin. Their denied affection exposed the quiet cruelty hiding beneath the veneer of noble order. Along the unspoken bonds they longed to claim, the lingering weight of being unwanted continued to shape the course of their existence. Across many corners of Tudor society, beneath the polished veneer of noble conduct and religious morality, relationships between powerful men and lower-ranking women unfolded under circumstances that offered no room for consent. These encounters, often described in softened terms by those who benefited from the silence, were in reality shaped by fear, coercion, and the imbalanced weight of authority. Women who served in great houses lived within structures where refusal was not an option, and where the consequences of resistance extended far beyond their own safety. When a child resulted from such encounters, the shadow of that coercion followed both mother and infant from the moment of birth, defining their place in the world before either could speak. The households where these events occurred treated them as matters to be managed quietly. A nobleman's desire was framed as inevitable. A servant's compliance was assumed. There was no mechanism to protect the woman, no language to describe what had been taken from her, and no expectation that justice might be served. Instead, the responsibility for maintaining silence fell on those most harmed by the situation. The woman was expected to resume her duties, conceal her distress, and cooperate with whatever arrangements were made for the pregnancy. Her experience vanished beneath the routines of the household, leaving her with memories she could not express without risking punishment. From the moment the child was born, a label settled upon them, one that condemned them for circumstances they could not control. They were marked as children of sin, not only in whispers but in the attitudes that surrounded them. the stigma followed them into every environment they entered. They were watched with suspicion, spoken to with condescension, and denied opportunities granted to those whose births aligned with accepted norms. Their existence reminded others of the moral failings embedded within the social order, failings that society preferred to attribute to the powerless rather than confront within the powerful. Neither mother nor child was allowed to articulate the truth. The woman, already vulnerable, faced swift retaliation if she attempted to name what had been done to her. The nobleman's reputation mattered far more than her suffering, and the household enforced silence with efficiency. Dismissal, exile, or forced marriage were common outcomes for those who dared to speak. Some were given a small sum of money and sent away. Others were placed under supervision to ensure they never revealed the nature of their relationship with the father. The child, growing up in environments shaped by concealment, learned early that questions about origins were unwelcome. As the child aged, the emotional weight of their label intensified. They sensed the discomfort they evoked. Even when adults avoided speaking openly, their presence in a room could shift conversations. Their progress in education or service could be dismissed as irrelevant. They internalized a sense of guilt for actions that had never been theirs. Even those caregivers who extended kindness did so cautiously, aware that showing too much affection risked drawing unwanted attention. The child learned to navigate a world in which their very existence was framed as a transgression. The mother carried the heavier burden. She lived with the knowledge that her child's life began through coercion, and that she had been denied any right to shape their future. When separated from the child, she often received only vague reports of their well-being, or none at all. The absence hollowed her days. When allowed to remain near the child, she faced constant fear that any sign of connection would be interpreted as disobedience. Her silence became a second form of violence, an enforced forgetting that demanded she bury not only the truth of what had happened, but the love she felt. Society, unwilling to confront the violence that produced these children, redirected blame toward the victims. Communities whispered about the woman's supposed impropriety, erasing the unequal power that had defined the encounter. Officials reinforced this narrative by treating the child as a disruption rather than as someone deserving care. Clergy preached repentance, but their sermons applied only to those without influence. The structures meant to uphold morality instead protected those whose actions contradicted it. The lives of these children reveal the deep fractures within the Tudor moral order, born into a world that condemned them from their first breath. They grew up navigating contradictions built into the society around them. They learned that authority could harm without consequence, that truth could be silenced without resistance, and that innocence offered no protection when power sought to define their identity. Many carried these lessons into adulthood, shaping their understanding of trust, belonging, and self-worth. Historians find few records describing the origins of these children. The documents were crafted to preserve reputations, not to reveal violations. Household accounts avoided explicit references. Parish registers reduced complex histories to simple labels. Correspondence spoke in euphemisms or avoided the subject entirely. Yet the patterns embedded in these silences speak unmistakably. Behind every missing detail lies a story deliberately concealed. A moment of coercion recast as discretion, and a child left to bear the weight of an adult's authority. Their constrained beginnings revealed how easily violence could be hidden within the routines of noble life. Their imposed shame exposed a society unwilling to confront the harm done in the name of order. Through the silences forced upon them, the lingering echoes of what they could never say continued to shape the lives they struggled to claim. There were years in which a few of them tried to step out of the narrow spaces assigned to them, as though a single gesture of resolve might rewrite the circumstances of their birth. Their attempts were usually quiet at first. A petition sent to a household steward, a letter claiming a forgotten promise, a discreet inquiry about a father who refused to be named. Nothing in their manner was aggressive, yet the reaction was always swift. The act of asking was treated as insolence. The suggestion of connection interpreted as a threat. Within the architecture of Tudor society, the structure remained fixed. Blood alone was never enough. Not when it came without a lawful marriage to legitimize it. These children, now grown, often carried tokens meant to prove who they were. A ring given in secrecy. A document signed by a noble hand. A midwife's testimony preserved through years of caution. They believed these fragments would speak on their behalf. Instead, each object became ammunition for their accusers. Proof not of belonging but of audacity. The families they confronted responded with practiced indifference, presenting themselves as victims of manipulation rather than participants in a long-buried truth. Those who dared to insist were labelled troublemakers, their names quickly tied to words like fraud, deceit, or treason. What made their situation so bleak was not the lack of evidence, but the lack of permission. In Tudor England, legitimacy was a gate locked from the inside. Only those already accepted could decide who might enter, and they did so with a vigilance shaped by fear. Every estate, every title, every inheritance risked dilution if the walls around lineage softened even slightly. This fear ensured that even the strongest claims were dismissed before they were heard. Officials refused to intervene. Servants kept silent. Neighbours looked away. The truth mattered less than the inconvenience of acknowledging it. Some of these claimants understood the danger, yet continued anyway. They had grown up on the edges of great halls where decisions were made, and the memory of those distant rooms stayed with them. Their ambition was not to seize power, but to reclaim the identity they were denied. They sought a place in a household that had once benefited from their existence. But the higher the rank of the man they confronted, the harsher the response became. Accusations multiplied. Motives were twisted. A child asking for recognition became, through the language of self-protection, an enemy of order. In several recorded cases, the punishment was fatal. A challenge to noble honour was treated as an attack on the stability of the realm. Rumours spread quickly, framing these individuals as dangerous pretenders. Trials were rare. Instead, a quiet disappearance or sudden illness carried out the sentence that no one would admit had been planned. For families of lesser status, the message was unmistakable, even if the blood that ran in their veins was the same blood that ruled courts and controlled armies. No one would dare repeat the attempt. To question power was to be crushed by it. Survival for these claimants depended on retreat. Those who lived learned to fade into the background, carrying their stories privately, letting the symbols of proof remain hidden in chests or buried beneath floorboards. Their lives became studies in restraint. Every conversation required caution, every memory a burden. They worked modest jobs, married without ceremony, and stayed far from the households their fathers once commanded. The contradiction between who they were and who they were permitted to be left a quiet ache that accompanied them through every season of their later years. Yet there was an undeniable courage in their attempts, even when failure was guaranteed. These individuals, raised in shadows, still believed that truth held weight. They believed that a grown man acknowledging his child should not be a crime, and that lineage should not be erased, simply because it was inconvenient. Their hope may have been fragile, but it revealed something the noble households feared most, the possibility that the past could surface, that hidden choices could demand accountability. Their very existence threatened the carefully managed narrative of purity and honour on which noble reputations depended. Still, every path they chose eventually narrowed into the same outcome. Silence. Silence imposed by force. Silence chosen for survival. Silence passed down as a warning. Their stories rarely reached any official record, appearing only in local whispers, in the confessions of aging servants, or in the scattered documents left behind in private letters. What they hoped to reclaim was not a fortune, but a place in a world that had already decided they did not belong. Their efforts formed a quiet testament to how thoroughly power shaped identity, and how easily a life could be bent away from its origins when the truth benefited no one at the top. Their failed attempts revealed how firmly the gates of legitimacy were kept closed. Their shattered claims exposed the unspoken reality that truth held no authority without permission. Over the traces of their disappearance, the weight of erased lineage continued to press on the lives that followed. There were a few whose lives took an unexpected turn, not because the world believed they deserved it, but because their existence had become too visible to ignore. Recognition, when it came, arrived as a controlled gesture, a calculated offering meant to pacify, not elevate. These individuals were granted minor titles, small estates, or ceremonial roles framed as generosity. Yet everyone understood the truth. Such acknowledgements functioned more like containment than acceptance. They were placed where they could be seen just enough to prevent scandal, but never enough to threaten anyone whose legitimacy was beyond question. Their new positions often felt like carefully arranged cages. A low-ranking title gave them a name, but not a future. They were permitted to stand near noble households without ever joining them, allowed to speak in certain rooms, but not influence what happened inside them. Their status came with rules that were strict but unwritten, enforced not by law, but by the stares and silences of those who believed themselves superior. Whenever they stepped beyond those invisible lines, a reminder would arrive. A correction delivered through a polite warning or a quiet humiliation at a public gathering. Even with acknowledgement, the expectations placed upon them were contradictory. They were told to be grateful, yet gratitude was never enough. They were expected to behave with humility. Yet flawless conduct did not erase the whispers that surrounded them. No matter how diligently they worked, or how respectfully they carried themselves, there remained a sense that their presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. They lived in the uncomfortable space between belonging and exclusion, where every gesture could be interpreted as overreach. The children born into this complicated status grew up with a painful awareness of the distinction between themselves and those considered rightful heirs. The difference was not found in education or ability, but in the circumstances of their birth, something they had no power to change. They watched siblings who shared their bloodline receive honors, inherit lands, and carry the family name with pride, while they themselves remained bound to roles chosen for them. In gatherings, they stood slightly behind. In formal records, they appeared in smaller handwriting. In conversations, they were spoken of as curiosities rather than equals. Yet being recognized brought responsibilities. Their achievements were scrutinized, their mistakes magnified. A legitimate child could fail and still recover. An acknowledged but unofficial child had no such freedom. Every error risked confirming what critics already believed, that they were unworthy of the name they carried only in whispers. Some reacted by withdrawing, performing duties quietly, and avoiding anything that drew attention. Others attempted to excel, though excellence often changed nothing except the intensity of the resentment directed toward them. The resentment came not only from the noble families themselves, but from those who served them. Servants who valued loyalty to the true line looked at these individuals with suspicion, interpreting their presence as a disruption to the proper order of things. Courtiers treated them as unpredictable variables, people who might one day claim more than what had been granted. Even allies maintained a cautious distance, unwilling to risk association with someone whose position could shift overnight. In this uneasy atmosphere, the few who were acknowledged developed a habit of self-restraint. They learned to measure their words, adjust their gestures, and anticipate how their actions might be interpreted. Their identities became performances shaped by the need to avoid provoking envy or anger. A smile too confident, a request too direct, or a friendship too close to someone of a higher rank could result in quiet repercussions. Their lives unfolded as a sequence of careful compromises, all made to preserve a place that was not entirely theirs to claim. What made their circumstances particularly bleak was the shadow cast by the legitimate heirs. These heirs did not need to be hostile. Their mere existence served as a barrier. Every comparison favoured them, not because of merit, but because of marriage contracts and church documents. The acknowledged child lived beside a standard they were never meant to surpass. Their accomplishments were treated as exceptions, their failures as proof of natural inferiority. Even in households where genuine affection existed, the imbalance remained unspoken but constant. Occasionally, one of these recognized individuals attempted to step beyond the role assigned to them, hoping to carve out a life defined by their own choices rather than inherited boundaries. Sometimes they found limited success through military service, marriage, or patronage from sympathetic nobles. But no matter how far they travelled or how much they achieved, the memory of their origin followed them. The world remembered the conditions under which they were accepted, and those conditions shaped every opportunity that came after. Recognition granted visibility, not freedom. In the end, their lives became quiet studies in endurance. They lived close to privilege but never truly possessed it. They held titles that provided stability but not authority. Their names were recorded, but always with an unspoken asterisk. Their existence proved that acknowledgement could be as confining as denial, another form of control disguised as kindness. Their partial recognition revealed how hollow acceptance could be when granted without true belonging. Their quiet existence beneath the shadow of legitimate heirs showed how deeply hierarchy shaped every breath they took, against the fading glow of borrowed titles. The path toward what waited ahead carried a weight no honor could soften. They carried the weight of abandonment long before they understood what the word meant. Childhood, for them, was not a season of discovery, but a slow recognition that something essential was always slightly out of reach. They were fed, housed, and clothed, but never fully acknowledged. Every gesture of care felt borrowed, and every moment of comfort carried an unspoken limit. As they grew older, they noticed how adults hesitated before answering simple questions about family, how glances shifted away when their origins were whispered in corners. Nothing was stated directly, yet the truth wrapped itself around them like a cold fog. They did not belong. Not entirely. Not securely. Not anywhere. The sense of being set aside settled into their bones. They were neither welcomed in noble circles, nor embraced among the poor. Among the elite, their existence was considered inconvenient, a trace of a scandal that respectable families preferred to forget. Among commoners, they were treated with suspicion, as though carrying noble blood without a name was a kind of curse. They learned to lower their voice, to avoid drawing attention, to live at the edges of gatherings. When others laughed or spoke freely, they remained quiet, watching from a distance, always aware that the world had no place designed for them. Some were sent away as children, not because of opportunity, but because distance concealed shame. They grew up in unfamiliar towns or distant villages, adopted but not embraced, present but never rooted. Their daily life was shaped by scarcity, scraps of bread, worn clothing, and hard labour. People around them assumed they were merely abandoned or orphaned, never imagining the truth, that they were linked by blood to houses of wealth and power. This gap between who they were and how they lived carved a quiet wound that followed them into adulthood. For others, exile was not geographic but emotional. They remained within sight of privilege, yet never touched it. They passed grand estates knowing their father lived inside, surrounded by servants and luxury, while they survived in cramped rooms nearby. The contrast was not accidental. It was a deliberate separation meant to protect reputations. They saw the carriages roll past. I heard the feasts through the walls, and watched processions celebrating heirs who enjoyed everything they were denied. The lesson was clear. Legitimacy defined worth. not blood. Poverty shaped many of their lives. Without support, they entered trades early, worked long hours, and lived in constant uncertainty. Even those who were intelligent or skilled found themselves blocked at every turn because no patron would risk sponsoring a child tied to a noble's hidden mistake. They carried the burden of another person's choices, yet bore all the consequences alone. Hunger was common, illness frequent, and dreams often abandoned simply because survival demanded all their strength. Still, they kept fragments of the stories. Their mothers whispered to them in secret. Some were told never to repeat those words. Others were warned that knowledge itself was dangerous. Yet these half-spoken histories became their only inheritance. They repeated them quietly to themselves during long walks, or in silence before sleep. Not because the stories gave comfort, but because they prevented erasure. In a world determined to forget them, remembering became a form of resistance. Occasionally, they encountered someone who recognized their features: an uncle's eyes, a grandfather's jawline, and the moment tightened the air around them. Recognition, however, did not bring inclusion. It brought discomfort, denial, or fear. Some were turned away harshly. Others were asked not to return. They learned that looking like their father could be more dangerous than helpful, especially when noble families wished to bury their past rather than face it. Their romantic lives often carried the same shadow. Partners questioned their background. Families hesitated to accept them, and any attempt to explain where they came from led to awkward silences or disbelief. A future built on uncertainty rarely found stable ground. Some never married at all, unsure whether starting their own family would simply repeat the pattern of abandonment they had survived. As they aged, the past did not fade. Instead, it deepened. Many found themselves living in poverty, even as noble households prospered just a few miles away. Some worked indirectly for the very estates that had refused to acknowledge them. Others travelled far, hoping that distance might free them from the weight of their origin. But no matter where they went, the knowledge followed. They were shaped by a lineage that had chosen to forget them. Still, there were moments, quiet, fleeting, when they shared their stories with someone they trusted. These confessions emerged like fragile threads pulled from a hidden tapestry. Over time, these whispered accounts formed a small, unrecorded history carried not in books, but in memory. The stories were passed from parent to child, sometimes distorted by fear, sometimes softened by time, but always present. This secret lineage became its own kind of legacy, a testament to lives that official records refused to hold. Their greatest tragedy was not only the life they lived, but the life they were never allowed to imagine. They could have been educated, influential, and respected. Instead, they learned early that their existence was an inconvenience handled through silence. In that silence, they built themselves from what little they had, crafting identities from the fragments left behind. They survived. But survival came with a cost, the constant reminder that they were never meant to be seen. In many ways, their stories reflect the deepest contradictions of Tudor society. A world obsessed with lineage also produced countless children it refused to acknowledge. A culture that prized honor tolerated profound injustice when it threatened reputation. A system built on order relied on secrecy to hide the disorder it created. These children lived at the intersection of all those truths, carrying burdens placed on them by others. Theirs was a quiet suffering, but not an empty one. It shaped generations, altered family lines, and created stories that hovered just outside the reach of history. The pain endured by these forgotten heirs continued long after their names disappeared, passed down as memories, warnings, and unresolved wounds. Their experiences revealed how rejection could echo through an entire lifetime. Their quiet endurance showed how the absence of acknowledgement could mark every choice they made. through the fragile stories they passed on. The weight of what had been denied whispered toward what waited ahead. They moved through the edges of history, with footsteps so light that the world rarely bothered to notice. Their names did not appear in royal records. Their faces were not captured in portraits, and their stories dissolved before they ever reached parchment. Yet they remained present, woven into the fabric of Tudor life in ways the public never fully understood. While kings stood at the centre of chronicles, commanding armies and shaping nations, their unacknowledged children drifted in the margins, living lives shaped by decisions they never had the power to influence. The contrast between visibility and disappearance defined their existence. The crowned father illuminated by glory, the forgotten child swallowed by silence. Their absence from monuments was no accident. Statues were carved for rulers, warriors, and noble heirs, figures who fit neatly into the public narrative of greatness. But these children belonged to a truth the kingdom preferred not to display. Acknowledging them meant acknowledging betrayal, desire, scandal, and weakness. It meant revealing the fractures beneath polished images of moral authority. So history looked away. And by looking away, it ensured their stories remained suspended in the shadows. Even so, faint traces of them endured. Servants whispered their identities behind closed doors. Villagers traded rumors about children who bore noble features. Midwives recalled births that were quickly erased from official memory. These fragments were rarely enough to form a complete story. But they carried the weight of something real, a presence too persistent to vanish entirely. In these murmured accounts, one could sense the outline of a life that should have been recorded, a life denied the right to stand beside its father's legacy. Some of these children lived within sight of royal splendor, moving through the same courtyards where the legitimate heirs walked. They watched ceremonies from a distance. You heard drums and trumpets marking the triumphs of a father who never spoke their name, and felt the heaviness of belonging without recognition. They could see the symbols of power everywhere. The banners, the guards, the heraldry, yet none of it reflected them. They stood close enough to observe, but too far to participate. Caught between proximity and exclusion, others lived scattered across the countryside, far from the grandeur of court. They worked in fields, apprenticed in small trade houses, or wandered from town to town in search of opportunities that never seemed to last. Their blood connected them to palaces, but their reality bound them to hardship. Some carried a sense of difference without understanding why, noticing the subtle ways people reacted to them or the peculiar discomfort that flickered across strangers' faces. They felt the truth long before they could articulate it. As they grew older, the silence surrounding their origins hardened into a permanent barrier. Attempts to ask questions were discouraged. Efforts to find answers often led to danger. Tudor society prized order and reputation above all, and these children represented a breach in both. Protecting the image of noble families demanded suppressing anything that might undermine it. The children became casualties of that suppression, living out lifetimes shaped by secrets they had no part in creating. Yet the bloodlines they carried remained unmistakable. In rare moments, someone might look at them and see the resemblance. A jawline identical to a duke's, eyes mirroring those of a king, or a posture too regal to dismiss. These moments often ended abruptly, as though recognition itself threatened to unravel something carefully controlled. Still, they lingered in memory, forming a quiet testament to the truth official documents tried to deny. Their stories spread in ways the powerful could not prevent. A kitchen servant passing along a rumour, a dismissed lady-in-waiting whispering a confession, a distant cousin sharing a half-remembered tale. Each contributed to a chorus of soft voices that survived long after the children themselves were gone. These whispers never made it into state archives, but they shaped private understanding, haunting the edges of history like shadows that refused to disappear. What made their situation more painful was not only the lack of recognition, but the awareness that they were intentionally ignored. This was not a natural omission or an innocent oversight. It was a choice made repeatedly, preserved through generations, reinforced by law, custom, and fear. To the kingdom, they were reminders of flawed kings and fallible nobles. Reminders that could not be allowed to stand beside official narratives of honor and control. Still, in the quiet spaces where history thins, their presence can be felt. In the face of a young soldier whose features resemble a monarch's too closely, in the story of a merchant unexpectedly granted land from an unnamed benefactor, in the diary of a nun who wrote cryptic lines about a child hidden for reasons she dared not reveal, traces remain, subtle but persistent, surviving because the human urge to remember outmatches any attempt to erase. Their legacy is not carried by statues or titles, but by the very silence that surrounds them. It is a silence heavy with meaning, shaped by longing, loss, and unanswered questions. And if one listens carefully, beyond the triumphs of kings and the polished chronicles of court, there is a second story beneath the official one, a story that insists on being heard despite centuries of neglect. Their voicelessness revealed how history chooses which lives deserve to be seen. Their hidden stories exposed the distance between blood and recognition. Beyond the careful silence guarding their existence, something long buried waits for its moment to surface. Stories have always carried the weight of what people could not say openly. And in Tudor times, the figure of the hidden child became a quiet symbol threaded through plays, poems, and whispered tales. Writers, constrained by censorship and fear, could not name real nobles or expose living scandals. Yet they found subtle ways to echo reality. A tragic child of unknown birth, a discarded heir, a youth raised in secrecy. These characters appeared again and again, each shaped by the shadows that surrounded them. Audiences recognized the hints, even if no names were spoken. They understood that fiction was often the only safe place where truth could breathe. The presence of these hidden children in culture revealed something deeper than entertainment. It showed how widely the phenomenon was known, how impossible it was to fully silence. Even when the kingdom tried to control narratives, ordinary people continued sharing versions of what they believed, or suspected, to be true. Tavern plays, travelling storytellers, and private letters all carried variations of the same theme, that the noble world was full of lives intentionally obscured. These stories served not only as warnings, but as acknowledgements of suffering that official records refused to contain. Literature, in its careful disguises, became a kind of refuge. Within the safety of metaphor, writers could explore the loneliness of a child who grew up knowing they were unwanted, or the bitterness of someone denied their birthright. They could portray the cruelty of a father who refused recognition, or the despair of a mother trapped between duty and love. Though these characters lived in fictional courts or imagined kingdoms, their pain mirrored that of countless real children whose histories were erased by design. Some works leaned toward moral lessons, suggesting that concealed sin would eventually be revealed. Others embraced tragedy, depicting lives cut short or hopes crushed under the weight of secrecy. Yet through all these variations, one thread remained constant: the acknowledgement that such children existed everywhere, walking invisible paths through the heart of society. Their presence in stories became a testament to the persistence of memory, even when the powerful demanded silence. What made these portrayals particularly haunting was how close they came to real experiences. The loneliness described in poems, the confusion written into stage directions, and the aching desire for recognition all reflected the emotional lives of those whose identities were hidden. In many narratives, the secret child wandered in search of belonging, unsure whether they had any right to claim it. That longing resonated across generations, transforming personal suffering into a collective symbol of injustice outside the world of art. However, most of these children never found resolution. Their lives did not follow the arcs of plays or epics. There was no climactic revelation, no public acknowledgement, no reunion crafted to satisfy an audience. Instead, their stories unfolded quietly, often ending without closure. They grew old, carrying questions no one would answer, and they passed from the world with truths still locked inside them. The contrast between the emotional clarity found in literature and the unending ambiguity of real life revealed society's deep reluctance to confront the harm it allowed. Yet the cultural legacy persisted. Each retelling, each fictional portrayal, kept the memory of these forgotten children alive, even when scholars debated whether certain characters were based on real individuals. The discussion itself indicated how strongly the theme lingered. Readers sensed the truth behind the fiction, and perhaps that was what unsettled them most. The realization that the stories were not merely invented tragedies, but reflections of an ongoing, unspoken reality. In later centuries, historians pieced together hints from letters, legal disputes, and court gossip. These fragments did not always provide full identities, but they illuminated patterns, sudden disappearances, unexplained guardianships, anonymous payments for a child's care. The cultural fascination with hidden children had not emerged from nowhere. It had grown from a society structured around silence. Literature merely translated that silence into symbols people could recognize. As time passed, some works began to question the moral foundation of the system itself. Instead of portraying illegitimacy as a stain, authors depicted the cruelty of the structures that enforced it. They asked why innocence should be punished for the failings of adults, why lineage mattered more than humanity, and why shame should fall on the child rather than the powerful parent. These questions did not always reach the courts, but they reached readers, planting doubts that would take generations to unravel. The irony remained that fiction offered empathy long before society did. On pages and stages, the hidden child could be seen. I heard and understood. In the world outside, countless real children continued to walk through life unnoticed, except by those who bore witness to their pain. Their absence from official histories made the cultural portrayals even more significant. Not because they replaced truth, but because they preserved its shadow. Even now, when people study Tudor culture, the trope of the secret heir remains one of the most recognizable symbols of a society built on appearance and suppression. It stands as both a dramatic device and a quiet indictment, reminding us of the lives denied their rightful place in the records of their time. These cultural echoes revealed how deeply the silenced continued to live beneath the stories people told. These fictional reflections exposed the truths society refused to confront openly. Through the symbols shaped from their absence, something unresolved drifted toward what still waited unspoken. Lives pushed to the margins of Tudor society revealed more about the kingdom than any royal decree or polished chronicle. These children, born into silence and raised under the weight of forbidden lineage, became unwilling witnesses to the contradictions that shaped their world, no matter where they were sent or how carefully their identities were concealed. The truth of their existence threaded through the age, like a thin fracture running beneath a grand facade. Tudor England celebrated order, honor, and religious virtue. Yet the lives of these children exposed how much of that order depended on hiding what did not fit the narrative. Each child represented a story the kingdom refused to tell. Their births occurred in dim rooms, attended by midwives sworn to secrecy. Their mothers were whisked away, silenced, or punished to protect reputations greater than their own. Their fathers, men who held noble titles, lands, and influence, continued their lives untouched, defended by a society eager to protect the powerful and condemn the vulnerable. And so these children grew up not as heirs to the world into which they were born, but as shadows lingering at its edge. Their suffering revealed itself slowly, often before they understood its cause. A question left unanswered, a stare that lingered too long, a door that closed when they approached. Over time, they learned to read these signs, understanding that their existence was something others needed to manage carefully. Silence became the shape of their identity, not spoken directly, but imprinted on every interaction. They lived in the tension between what they knew and what they were forbidden to ask. The hypocrisy they confronted was not abstract. It shaped every detail of their daily life. A noble father could publicly praise virtue while privately arranging for his own child to be sent away. Court officials who preached moral discipline did nothing to challenge the injustice of erasing these lives. Families obsessed with lineage refused to acknowledge bloodlines that did not serve their goals. In a system where legitimacy defined worth, these children were denied worth before they even spoke their first words. Yet their absence from official life did not mean they left no mark. They appeared in gossip, in rumors, in quickly corrected slips of the tongue. A passing resemblance caused a moment's discomfort. A shared feature sparked whispered speculation. These small fragments, unnoticed by the powerful, formed a quiet map of truths that outlived those who tried to hide them. Servants remembered, midwives remembered, distant relatives remembered. Memory persisted even where records did not. Many of these children grew into adults whose identities remained unfinished. They carried questions that hovered like unspoken ghosts. Questions about their origins, their families, their place in the world. Some found clues tucked into old letters. Others only had memories of expressions they could never fully interpret. A few dared to confront the truth directly, but the cost of doing so was often unbearable. In a society that punished challenge and rewarded obedience, their attempts at self-discovery were met with resistance, denial, or danger. Others moved through life with an unspoken ache, shaping their choices around the silence they had inherited. They avoided conversations about lineage. They hesitated to form families of their own, fearing the repetition of a cycle they wished to escape. They carried the weight of secrets that were never theirs to bear, yet shaped every part of who they became. Even when they died, many left behind questions that no one living could answer. But perhaps the most revealing truth is this: the children the kingdom refused to acknowledge became the clearest mirror of its contradictions. If Tudor England truly valued virtue, why did it punish innocence? If it prized lineage, why did it erase bloodlines that threatened its carefully controlled hierarchies? If it claimed piety, why did it permit injustice to thrive behind the shelter of noble titles? In these children, the society's unseen wounds became visible. Their stories, fragmented, whispered, incomplete, remind us that history is not defined solely by those who held power. It is shaped just as deeply by those whom power tried to erase. While kings rode into battle, issued decrees, and fathered heirs to solidify dynasties, these forgotten children lived in the wake of those decisions, bearing the consequences of desires and politics they had no part in choosing. In many ways, they became the kingdom's conscience, though no one intended it. Their suffering exposed the cost of maintaining appearances. Their silence reflected the weight of secrets the powerful were unwilling to confront. Their endurance revealed the strength that grows in places where recognition is denied. Even centuries later, their absence in official narratives urges us to look closer, to ask what else might lie hidden beneath the stories we have been given. Because history, when examined carefully, shows patterns. It shows who was valued and who was ignored. It shows whose lives were documented and whose were dismissed. And in the Tudor world, these children, silent, erased, unnamed, represent the clearest evidence that the kingdom's grandeur was built not only on power, but also on concealment. Their existence is a wound history never tended, a wound created by a society that claimed order but bred injustice. A wound marked by the contrast between what was shown publicly and what was suffered privately. And that wound, carried through generations, remains visible even now when we look back with clearer eyes. Their lives revealed how power shaped not only privilege, but also abandonment. Their silence exposed the distance between the stories preserved and the truths deliberately buried. Through the shadow they cast upon Tudor memory, something unresolved continues to drift just beneath the surface. And as this story draws to a close, thank you for staying with the voices that history tried to quiet. These children were denied recognition in their own time. But tonight, you have given them a place to be seen, if only for a moment. Good night. May your rest be gentle, steady, and untouched by the long shadows they carried.